Hello, welcome back to the Bio 122 video lectures. These coming from chapter 27 on animal diversity. This is video 8 and the final video from this chapter talking about the evolutionary history of animals. So here is a chart, a timeline that's available in your textbook. I just want to go through some important points with you. This is a linear scale going back to the beginning of the Earth. Um, and from geologic evidence, from astrological evidence, from geothermal evidence, physics, we have a pretty good idea of the age of the Earth um, being about 4.5 billion years old, give or take a couple of million. Um, and so, of course, at that time, the Earth was very hot, very unstable, and the atmosphere would be primarily methane, several other poisonous gases, but certainly no oxygen. And over a period of time, water, thought to be primarily coming from comets and asteroid collisions with the Earth, water developed or start forming on Earth over the next half a billion years. And then we get the very first evidence of life on Earth. And here is that evidence, um, dating fossilized evidence dating back about 3.7 billion years old. We can date the rocks, we can date the soils, we can actually identify organic materials inside these fossils, shown in these kind of dashed lines, is the fossil itself. But this isn't the fossil of an individual organism. These are actually the structures produced by millions and millions of much smaller organisms, because the first life on Earth would have been a prokaryotic organism, um, very closely resembling the modern day cyanobacteria. So this bluish greenish bacteria, this is showing several strands. These bacteria still exist today in a fairly unchanged form, apparently. So this is very much probably our great, 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 great ancestors. And in modern times, we can also see they produce living in colonies in water. This is a stromatolite. This structure here, this kind of triangular thing, this is actually the waste products being produced by this bacteria in a colony. And again, this is commonly produced, has been throughout millennia. And when they would be covered with sediment, here we have a fossilized stromatolite. So that's what we're actually looking at here, something that we can even see in modern times. This is very rare to find, but we have found this in two very disparate areas of the Earth, as demonstrated by this uh, article, this scientific finding from 2016, showing a example of some of these fossilized colonies of bacteria, the earliest fossils on Earth. And the two places that they have been found is in Australia, in rock outcroppings, and also in a cross section of a outcrop of rock in Greenland. So on two completely different sides of the Earth, which makes perfect sense, understanding how plate tectonics moves things around. But it also, being this old, it's very, very difficult to find these because of the fact that the Earth is a living, changing thing. But this is the earliest physical fossilized evidence we have of life, not animal life, of all life. So this is 3.7 billion years ago, but we can see here this there had to be already millions of these things around. So certainly they just didn't pop up overnight. And so that's where we can estimate that while we have physical fossil evidence of 3.7 billion years, if we look at the time period of when we finished with some of the heavy bombardments of the Earth, that we can get a pretty good estimate that probably around 4 to 4.1 billion years ago is when life first formed. So about half a billion years after the Earth itself formed, based on the evidence we have available. Now, of course, during this entire time, number one, life only existed in the oceans, and it was all single cell prokaryotic organisms, bacteria and archaea. And also, we can look at fossil evidence and geologic evidence, and we can see that none of these organisms were using oxygen. Instead, they were producing oxygen, because we don't have any evidence of oxygen being a major component of the atmosphere until about 3.5 billion years ago, which is also coinciding with where we have fossil evidence of organisms that can engage in photosynthesis. So, of course, where does oxygen come from? It's a waste product of photosynthesis. Prior to this time, the Earth's atmosphere was primarily carbon dioxide, which is perfect if you want to do photosynthesis, because photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide together with sunlight. Well, the waste product is oxygen. So during this period from 3.5 billion years, a lot of organisms started using photosynthesis. And so we start seeing a buildup of atmospheric oxygen. Why do we know that? It's because geologic evidence, we can see the type of minerals that were produced during the times before this. There's no evidence of oxidation, and minerals that require oxygen are not present in the geologic record. And then suddenly they are. So where does the oxygen come from? It comes from life, but it comes from life doing photosynthesis. So as we build up more and more oxygen, what actually happens is that actually becomes toxic. So these photosynthetic organisms are producing waste material, oxygen, and they end up actually poisoning their own environment, their own climate. So we actually see a rather large decrease in the evidence of life until we now start getting the first evidence of eukaryotic organisms. And one of the critical features of a eukaryotic organism is the organelle known as mitochondria that does the opposite of photosynthesis. It uses oxygen together with glucose to produce ATP, and then the byproduct of that is going to be carbon dioxide. So, in essence, around this time, we actually start forming a stable ecological environment where eukaryotic organisms use oxygen and produce carbon dioxide, and photosynthetic organisms, which also would include some other eukaryotes like plants, will, and together with the bacteria and archaea, will produce carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is being used and producing oxygen, and then the eukaryotics use, and then mitochondrial parts of eukaryotics will use the oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. So now if we keep going along in our fossil record, what we see is around about 1.2 billion years ago, we start getting the first evidence of sexual reproduction, and about 1.5 billion years ago, the first evidence of multicellular life. So remember, these first eukaryotes were protists. Then the first multicellular life were plants. And then we continue along here, and the evidence is that about 600 million years ago or so. The first animals appear. Um, During this time, they were fairly simple animals, but they would have evolved from the protist, as we talked about in our section on the phylogenetic charts and the evidence we have there. And then that leads to something we're going to talk about today, the Cambrian explosion, where suddenly the diversity of animals really became more intense. And then at about 400 million years ago, we start seeing evidence of the first forms of life on land, both plant and some animal life. And then the dinosaurs were all about 400 million years ago, and then they died off. Mammals and some of the reptiles continued along that line. And then we start getting the first flower species on land. And that becomes important because the flowers also coincides with the evolution of the first arthropods. So the insects, those two things go hand in hand together because the sexual reproduction of the flowers and plants that have flowering plants also relies on the insect population to spread the pollen. So there is a symbiotic relationship there that drives the evolution of animals into the form that we know as the arthropods. Then this is grossly misrepresented because if you notice, there's a little blue line there showing when the first humans would have appeared on this timeline, which is only about 2 million years ago. And if you realize that each of these hash marks represents 250 million years, the size of that arrow is way too large. Because if we actually made it reflective of the actual time in which humans first appear on this record, you wouldn't be able to see it. It would be smaller than a pixel. So we have, as humans, our entire history represents just such a tiny portion of the entire Earth, but life is also much, much more extensive than is represented by us lowly humans. So that's always a fun thing to look at. Meanwhile, we're talking about animals. So let's look first at what we know about the first animals and this Cambrian explosion and a few things that happened later. Okay, so what happened from the time that the first animals evolved from protist, and this is talking about about 600 million years ago, give or take a few million. And this is the Ediacaran period, known in the fossil record, and we can see these type of fossils are fairly simple. But we actually have been able to identify some of the DNA sequences, even from some of these fossilized animals, and look at organic materials of fossils. And we can see that they're actually very similar to the DNA sequences of sponges, modern day sponges, and the modern day cranocytes, which we talked about in the previous lecture about the modern day protist that is probably our closest relative in the protist world. If we look at artist depiction of what some of these animals would have looked like, they're fairly simple. This right here is actually an animal. It's not a plant, but it is a sessile animal that is just waiting for the food to come to it. It has some obvious segmentation that you will study of modern day animals in your lab exercises for animal diversity. Here's another one also with some obvious segmentation and some kind of curvy ones, and this one. So, but the point is we have fossil evidence of these, but we can see that they all have certain characteristics. First of all, they were soft bodied. So we don't have evidence of a skeletal structure, even an exoskeleton. So they would have been kind of spongy, very much like a comb jelly, a jellyfish or a sponge. Um, so, to give you some examples of what these would have looked like. Here is one fossil. Again, it has some strong segmentation in it. You can kind of see these ridges in it. But those aren't bones. That's just uh, proteins that would have formed kind of a structure there. But we do know they're multicellular because this is actually there's probably a million cells there, and they're also oxygen breathing. We can find evidence of some of the proteins and some of the organic molecules. And so you can see that these organisms were using mitochondria. Eukaryotic organisms use mitochondria to make ATP to power muscles, to power nervous tissue. Over here is a picture of a fossil that's just from a few years ago. This was in 2016. This was published after being found in China. And here we were able to get actually some detailed organic molecules. And we're even able to identify some of the cells that are the nervous system. So I'm a neuroscientist, so I was quite excited by this find of an early nervous system. And down here is an artist rendition of what this animal would have looked like in life. But this is the type of things that we would have had during this period. There wasn't a lot of variety yet. So now let's move to a very important stage in animal evolution, known as the Cambrian period. We also refer to this as the Cambrian explosion. Now, the reason we say that is because if we look at the fossil record, it's not a real explosion we're talking about. So please don't tell me that. We're just kind of using that word as a metaphor because it's like there's only a few types of animals, and then suddenly there were a bunch of different varieties of animals. But they also developed, and then after a few million years, were extinct. And then new ones took their place. And so it's as if this explosion was going on and new animals were forming and dying off, and the new ones were taking their place. And that's why we call this the explosion, but it's just meaning it's one of the most rapid periods of animal evolution that ever happened. And in fact, most of the phyla that exist today in your phylogenetic chart, all of those phyla can trace their ancestry back to this Cambrian period. And so this is why it's really critical for understanding of animal diversity. So here is a artist rendition of what life would have looked like in the oceans. And of course, at this point, this is well before any form of life was living on land. All life was in the oceans, including plant life, protists, and everything else. And so what we see here is we kind of first see this gigantic, very menacing type creature here, which would definitely have probably been a predator. We have fossil records of these guys. That's how we know what they look like. Up here, you have a very large fish-like structure, some more swimming up here. So we have a wide variety. Some of these look like some of the modern day arthropods, but they're also generally much larger in many cases. And here's kind of a rotifer type thing that was quite large. So any of these would likely to be some sort of predator. But then I want to direct your eye to what would probably be prey. And this is going to demonstrate some of what we refer to as a predator-prey relationship, which was an important part of evolution going on here. So what we mean by that let's draw our attention back to this very fierce looking creature here, which seems to have this like rotating mouth and these claws that are coming after things. And if you can see here, there's actually what looks like a little animal that's trying to get away. This one's about to eat it. So if this is the predator, what we're saying is they are evolving different mechanisms to kill with because these would be carnivores. Over here, we have what might be a prey that might very well be an herbivorous and is eating plant life instead. But how are they going to avoid being eaten? Well, perhaps they have to become very fast. So different structures can evolve at random, but if they impart a speed advantage to this animal, that might very well then be passed along to their offspring through the process of sexual reproduction. But here, down at the surface of the seafloor, we see another worm-like structure, but we've seen these things with like these spikes coming up. So that's another way that a potential prey can defend themselves. So this animal here may not want to eat this thing down here because it may actually be very damaging to it. But at the same time, it's also possible for predators to evolve ways to avoid these spikes. And so now the prey is at a disadvantage. Likewise, we have, this is most likely some sort of burrowing animal that may have a shell to it. Here is another burrowing animal. So it's another way you can get away from predators is hide and live your life under the seafloor. But of course, then the predators could just get better at digging. And then here is a much larger one that is kind of a combination protecting itself in the seafloor, but probably also a partial predator themselves waiting for something to swim by, and then they would grab it and pull it in. So you have to protect yourself, but you also have to be able to get food. And if you're a carnivore, you have to do it by killing other animals and finding prey. So over here, we actually see one of our modern day partners in life, the sponges. So these have been around for a very long time through all periods of animal life. So that's what we're talking about with this kind of explosion that happens, but this great variety of animals. So another term that we use for this, so the Cambrian period, the Cambrian explosion, but sometimes we talk about the Cambrian radiation. And that's looking at it in the viewpoint of the phylogenetic tree. So here are the modern day phylums. And here is the first point, which is the evolution of the first animals from protists. Now remember, we have branches that come off. So this is where the sea sponges would go. And they kind of passed right through. The cyntophores, so the jellyfish and the cnidarians, the comb jellies, and things like that also branched right through, with perhaps a branch during the Cambrian radiation. But if we notice, most of the other modern day phylum can trace an ancestor that was a branching point during the Cambrian explosion. The vast majority, of the major evolutionary changes that occurred in animals that we see in modern day animal phylum can all be traced back to this Cambrian radiation, and much fewer would trace back to the original animals. So that's why this period is really, really critical to understanding the diversity of modern animal life. So that means that we want to think about what exactly caused that. So why did we suddenly get this incredible, almost experimentation? Well, one of the answers is, remember we talked about oxygen didn't exist early on the earth didn't exist with the first forms of life. It was actually a byproduct of organisms doing photosynthesis that created the oxygen. So as oxygen content built up, that also coincides with, notice this line, pretty much no oxygen. Uh, but now there is a big increase of oxygen, partly because of advanced evolution of plants. But notice the date here, this is about 600 million years. So that's the Ediacaran period where the first animals evolved. But this is that those very simple animals. And now we continue on until the Cambrian explosion. So let's go back and look at when that was. The Cambrian explosion begins, so averaging around 400 million years ago, starting at about 542. So if we look at about 542, we get kind of a stable point there. And then going up to 400, it's during this period that we suddenly start getting a lot more oxygen, coinciding with kind of the middle to end of the Cambrian period. And if we think about why is that important, is because we need oxygen to make ATP more efficiently. That's what our mitochondria are doing for us, taking oxygen and glucose and producing 36 molecules of ATP, much more than we could possibly get through anaerobic metabolism, through glycolysis. Well, why is that important? It's because animals have two unique forms of tissue that's not found in any other kingdom of life. Muscle tissue. And muscle tissue requires enormous amounts of ATP to function. And if you're going to be a predator and you're going to be strong, you need lots of muscle tissue, and therefore you need lots of ATP, which means you need lots of oxygen. That means the more oxygen is available, the better off you're going to be able to build big muscles. For the prey, also to evolve the ability to go fast, to swim fast, to get away from the predators, that's going to be important too, needing more oxygen to make more ATP for your muscles. Likewise, how do you know who you're going to attack? How do you know how to get away from things? How do you form memories? You need a brain. You need a sensory system. You need a control of those motor muscles. So the brain also is unique to animals, and it also requires enormous amounts of ATP, therefore needs enormous amounts of oxygen. So it's probably not a coincidence. In fact, there's a strong correlation between the amount of oxygen that was available in the seawater and the Cambrian explosion. Likewise, there was also calcium levels there's not a chart for it, but they were also increasing. And so the availability of calcium is a critical control structure also for both muscles and nervous tissue. So in order to have an efficiently working nervous system and muscular system, calcium is also required for that. So those things are not an accident. They all had to happen together. Another thing that your textbook talks about is the fact that we start seeing changes in the actual topology of the Earth as continental plates move around, and the oceans start changing. So we start forming some of the more shallow oceans, the more shallow seas. And so instead of very, very deep sources of water, we start getting more of a spread. So we're closer to the surface. It's not as so that difference of shadow, which means there's going to be more oxygen available in the water. As you go down in the water, very deep, oxygen levels drop off dramatically. But it also allows the animals evolving in that area to interact with each other, and therefore a greater chance of sharing DNA and then wilder variation in the genome, and therefore developing a new species. So that seems to be an important feature too. And in fact, it's where shallow seas were existing at that time is where we see this most robustly in the fossil record to shells that were found in the previous areas of shallow seas. I've already talked about the predator-prey relationships. And then the last thing that your textbook talks about is maybe one of the most critical things. With all of these other things, the fourth one is also true, that the ability to form these wild variations is made much easier if you only have to change a few genes in order to create 6 legs, 8 legs, 2 legs, put antenna in different place. And so this enormous experimentation in body shape is made much simpler by the presence of Hox genes. Well, now we can do genetic detective work, and we can look at mutations that have occurred in the modern day Hox genes of all the animals, and we pretty much have done the genome of everything now. And we can use that as kind of a clock to go backwards in time to see when the original Hox gene would have formed. And it coincides with, you guessed it, the Cambrian period of animal evolution. So all of these things start coming together to help explain why we suddenly get this rapid increase in the diversity of animal life. Okay, so that's the end of this section, and this covers the entire chapter. So I'll be back with you soon with videos on the next chapter. Good day.